Hello and welcome to the Business of the Business podcast. I'm your co-host JP John Paz from the Two Man Power Trip. Of course, joining me, the financial wrestling genius himself, Mr. Lavie Margolin. Lavie, how you doing today, sir?
Hey, John, I'm doing well as we move along. I don't know if these are the dog days of summer. I forgot what that's considered, but summer is nearing its end. Labor Day isn't too far away, especially by the time most people listen to this, but plenty of news and things to talk about.
Nice. Now let's start it off. Maybe a little bit of an interesting topic here. Lessons from MMA. Where are we going with this one?
So we're going old school. Campbell McLaren, of course, one of the originals from the UFC, who has been successful promoter with Combate Global the last several years. He had an interesting missive on LinkedIn that I thought was worth reflecting on, especially as it can relate to pro wrestling. How did Combate Global reach profitability and become self sustaining in 2024 when so many other alternative sports and MMA leagues never reach economic viability? Our achievement is even more impressive when you factor in the very difficult current environment. Combate discovered the MMA version of Moneyball. We looked at what we returned the highest ROA for athletes and events. Prior to COVID, Combate was selling 5 to 6,000 hard tickets in markets like Tucson, Guadalajara, Fresno, McAllen, Sacramento, and Monterrey. Ticket sales above 5,200 got us to break even, and selling that many tickets is not easy. When COVID entered our live events, we soon discovered that a custom built and very cool studio delivered the same or better TV ratings at a fraction of the cost. As we looked at available athlete talent, we saw that young, highly motivated new fighters delivered the higher TV ratings than more experienced and more expensive athletes. I also add the extreme dedication factor of management. Okay, so two factors in terms of making this challenger or alternative brand MMA is probably the best way to look at it. Really focused on the Hispanic market, on some of larger stations in Hispanic targeted homes. So one is rather than go on the road and being able to draw fairly well, that they built a studio and they're spending less money on talent. So interesting to think about the studio, because I don't know if it's the answer to problems for pro wrestling organizations, because it could get stale with TNA being in the impact zone, for such a long time. It did feel stale, but there is something to not looking to always book the biggest arenas, especially if you can fill them. So along with that, AEW's management have been really happy with their Collision ROH residency in Arlington in particular. Management have been delighted with the crowd heat for heels and the overall atmosphere inside Esports Stadium. They've been thrilled. So really thinking about this mostly for AEW, because most other promotions are pointed in the way that they should be. Of course, WWE is doing well in big arenas. TNA tends to book smaller venues, MLW, NWA, as well. New Japan sort of finding their way in terms of what's the right size venue now. So really thinking about it from an AEW perspective. So, John, to me, I think you're not always going to get residencies and governments to pay for you to use their their video game arenas and so on. So to me, it might be sort of, unless they have these opportunities, pointing back to the Southeast a little bit, maybe being in Jacksonville every 3 weeks, and then, within 200-300 miles, have your trucks going in and out of that in smaller southeastern venues, because as we've talked about for quite a while, it seems kind of ridiculous to keep booking these NBA sized arenas or half NBA sized arenas, and we're seeing the advances now under 1,000. It seems to be that they get to a little bit over 2,000 for the most case, and sometimes better than that. And of course, there's outliers we'll talk about, um, Australia potentially towards the end of the show, but they really have to find a better way. And I think McLaren's advice here is prescient. I think just thinking about like finding, if not a permanent venue, because that does get stale, especially if you're doing so much TV on a national basis, but finding the right size venues.
Definitely. Now, as far as some of the right size venues, what's the biggest venue, or what's the event that's going to be the biggest seller of all time?
So, John, this was a surprise to me. I know you're a lot more tuned into baseball. Have you heard about this MLB Speedway Classic that's about a year away?
No, I actually did not, believe it or not.
So they are, MLB Speedway Classic is an upcoming special game to be played by the Braves and the Cincinnati Reds on August 7th, 2025. The game will be played at Bristol Motor Speedway, of course, in Tennessee. It's a 146,000 seat NASCAR racetrack. This will be the first regular season MLB game played in the state of Tennessee, and so on. So 146,000 seats. Now, I don't know if it's as simple, like if you were to think about like pro wrestling, I don't know if it's as simple to put a ring, in the center where they usually do the car repairs or whatever you would call it, right? Because imagine how far away some people will be from that. But I think there's a lot of potential there. But I don't know if it makes sense. Like, there is something to like this huge record-breaking event, but it might make more sense to just do WrestleMania and charge higher ticket prices, and then you don't have to worry about like if you only draw 90,000, right, and you're only filling up 70% of the venue, what will it look like with all these like metal empty seats and so on? So I was having some fun looking up like what are some of the, at least in modern times, basically counting everyone at the beach at the event originally. So Rod Stewart has the record for the biggest gig of all time. In 1994, he performed at the Copacabana Beach to 3.5 million people celebrating New Year's Eve. So if you were on the beach that day, then Rod Stewart gets credit for it, although I'm sure many people were interested in trying to see him. In Mexico City, there was 132,000 people that attended a boxing match. Julio Cesar Chavez defended his belt against Greg Hogan. So, and then of course we have the longstanding Mayday Stadium, where most of that was comped, or the equivalent of that, people forced to go, where at least 165,000 people, 180, 190,000 people were there. So, John, do you think, I think like for me, like maybe like a SummerSlam event where you really go for this record, it would just be like an impressive thing, worth doing, but it's a lot of time and a lot of effort into it.
Yeah, it's crazy to think like how many people you could actually get to do it, but what would be the draw for wrestling? You'd have to do something with The Rock, I would guess. The Rock and somebody in the main event, but man, that's a hard feat to get 100,000+ wrestling fans. I know 75,000 for 2 nights at Mania is pretty damn impressive. But man, 100,000 one show, or 200,000 even. Obviously the collision in Korea, so crazy.
Yeah, I think like what helps is that if you're in like an interesting venue, like it's naturally going to draw some fans, right? Like, although it's losing a bit of its luster, the NHL Frozen, what is it, New Year's Eve? I mean, sorry, New Year's Day, when they do the they freeze the baseball field or the football field, right? Like you're just like, okay, that sounds crazy. I wanna see that. So there's something to that. You need a mainstream draw, but it's sort of like it's that risk of like embarrassment too, right? Like when WWF had booked the LA Coliseum, and then and weren't selling very well, and then claimed it was because of threats on Sergeant Slaughter's life, because even if you were to end up doing 40,000 seats, it's a 100,000 seat venue. So, it just doesn't look good. So it's a big risk. The amount you could charge for tickets isn't like, especially once you get, into the grandstand, it can't be too much. So like financially, it might not be worth it. But I think there'd be something for the WWE wanting to hold the record for like the all-time most attended pro wrestling event, even though most people don't think about it.
Yeah, for sure. What about some other maybe attendance numbers, or maybe just as far as who's the most relevant promotion, attendance, and then social media, etc.?
Yeah, so we've often talked about like who's the third biggest promotion. So I want to think about it like in a different way, with four promotions and they're basically their U.S. based efforts. What's interesting about it is that they're all so different that um, not necessarily that you can make an argument for each, but there's something to each that each has its own advantages. So today we're talking about GCW, TNA, New Japan, especially pointed towards the US, and WOW. So let's start with attendance. So for WOW, it's really a negligible number. Um, we're not sure yet exactly, but they at the beginning of August they may have taped their full season 3. They did charge for tickets, and there was meet and greet. The meet and greet seemed to be doing well. I don't know, how well they did in terms of ticket sales on these multiple sessions, multiple days. But as of the moment, they're not trying to draw fans at any touring or even like one-off shows. So it's not really part of their business plan.
It is
They
fun to
could
kind of.
tour the U.S.
It is fun to see like who is really the number third, who's really the most popular.
Where John, can you hear me okay?
Yep, now I can.
Okay. So was it coming through in terms of talking about WOW and attendance?
Yes.
Okay. So so with GCW, they could tour the US, worldwide, all that sort of thing. But it's really going to be in the hundreds, right? It's been a while since obviously the Hammerstein was a one-off show, but even in, let's say, Atlantic City, since they moved venues at the same casino, um, it's we haven't heard about them doing over 1,000, fans, something like that. So they sort of know who they are, and they're kind of pointing their way around. With TNA, usually drawn like the hundreds, as we've talked about, like for years, sort of like a typical show is like 200. I know that gets people upset, but a typical show is like 200. Then there's outlier events. We've had Montreal, Hard to Kill, and so on. With New Japan, they've cut down to a few shows a year in the US. And on their own, it's getting harder to draw, but maybe about 2,000 per event, whether it's in Northern California. We'll see in Washington, D.C. if they get to 2,000 now, when they ran in New York a couple years ago. But they're an accelerant for AEW, right? For that one-off show when Worlds Collide, that really helps AEW, and it's really partly New Japan's doing. So for attendance, I would give the nod to New Japan, if you agree, John.
Yeah. Yep.
Now, buzz is a hard thing, to buzz and social media. Maybe we should combine those, but let's actually talk about buzz. So one of the things that you might think about when you think about buzz is sort of search, right? Like, what are people searching for? So when you look at these four promotions, and there might be different ways of GCW, let's see here, and WoW are like, you know, like they're sort of like skimming the bottom like of the numbers. Like it's almost like hard to see like any search when you include all four of these at once. Um, Maybe even like WoW is like a little bit, ahead of that. New Japan has big spikes where it's mostly ahead of TNA, and then TNA sort of like has its moments there. So for GCW, especially, maybe the feed that I'm being served on Twitter and so on, it's people are always buzzing, but it's to a very niche, limited audience, but people are always excited about it. TNA, they have, and this is anecdotal, right? Not a scientific analysis. This is anecdotal. TNA always has its like hardcore fans. Anytime you mention like what's that joke with the pronoun Joe Henry now, right? Like he appears, right? Like anytime you mention TNA, like their defenders will appear. With New Japan, I don't like. I feel like it's not there. Like that sort of excitement when you talk about New Japan isn't there as much, anymore. Even though like the interest might be multiples when something big happens, and WoW was like negligible. No one really like talks about it at all. So for me, it's hard to say. I would say outside of WoW being behind them, I don't think there's like a winner here of the three, John.
Interesting. Yeah, it's tough to say.
With social media now, this is interesting because TNA, and we'll talk about later sort of the some of the numbers, they have these legacy subs, right? Like when the promotion was like so much bigger that they were able to build up their track record, on a lot of these platforms. New Japan has a lot of followers, as well. So I would say New Japan and TNA sort of are not tied necessarily, but I would sort of say they stand out above the others. Now, viewership is a bit apples to oranges, right? So GCW is getting paid by Fight Plus for their every show that they run, or I don't know if it's broken down by every show, if there's a certain commitment of running a certain amount of shows, or if they exceed a certain viewership, if they get bonus, whatever it is. But it's not, it's not for the masses. It's behind a paywall. TNA is, we haven't seen the numbers too consistently, but they were doing like around 100,000 on Access. They have a lot of streaming distribution. And they're ahead of whatever New Japan is doing on Access, as far as we know. So GCW would be out of the debate. TNA would be above New Japan. Now, WoW is a different story as well. So what WoW is doing, from the last we heard, is multiples of whatever TNA is doing. So they have their syndication, right? And it's being renewed for a third year. So we have to assume that the numbers are holding up or maybe even getting better. So somewhere between 200 and 400,000 a week. If I'm going to mention streaming, I should also mention TNA, right? That they have a lot of streaming distribution. So in terms of viewership overall, you have to give it to WoW. But there's also something about like engaged viewership. Like I feel like with WoW, it's a lot of people like, okay, like I just watched the news on WLNY 55. Okay, WoW is coming out. I'll just keep it. So here, I would say TNA and WoW. Then finally, I would look at the allegiances, sort of like in terms of relevancy, like how are you connected to the broader pro wrestling world, especially GCW, obviously, there's some, especially with TNA, their relationship with WWE is very strong right now. With New Japan, obviously, they have AEW, CMLL, and WoW is in a world of its own. So I would give the, if not the nod to TNA, maybe tied with New Japan. So both sort of like the leaders there. So when when I'm looking at it, at least in terms of like a box chart, it's not necessarily like who has the most or whatever it may be. I think that it separates things out that for the most part, GCW is successful doing its own niche thing. WoW is in its own mainstream niche thing, I guess the best way to put it. And it really comes down to, is it New Japan in the US or TNA? So again, to review, New Japan does a limited amount of shows, but draws more. With New Japan and TNA buzz, that TNA has its hardcore consistently, but New Japan has more excitement when there's something to get excited about. With social media, New Japan has very high numbers. TNA does as well, especially some of the outside legacy numbers. So kind of the equivalent. Viewership in the US, you definitely have to give that to TNA. Allegiances depends on what you think, whether it's relationships that are more mutually sort of more shared with AEW and CMLL, or TNA with WWE. So my conclusion is a bit of a toss up between TNA and New Japan, depending on what you're prioritizing. What do you think, John?
Yeah, I want to say New Japan, but I feel like they've fallen off since AEW's taken a bit of their business. I might say GCW, just overall. Seems like they have the best attendance. Seems like they got, I don't know, more shows, I guess you would say, more coverage on social media. It is tough to say because you could say, oh, well, TNA sold 4,000 tickets for Montreal. Hey, they sold out Philly, ECW Arena, possibly 1,000 each night, somewhere around there. So it is tough to say who is really number three. I might have to say GC Dub.
Cool. So it's still up for debate, even though WoW has by far the highest viewership. To me, it's more of it's a television program that happens to air pro wrestling as opposed to being of this world.
Yep. So what about maybe the NWA? Where do you sit on them?
So, John, I don't know if you're seeing this on a daily basis. I'm sure you are. It feels like at least once a day, the NWA is signing someone to a deal. Are you seeing it?
Yes, big time.
And again, this is only an example, just because I have it in mind. I know who he is. No shade meaning no shade meant. I actually liked his work in WWE when I watched on a limited basis at the time. But does the NWA need to sign Paul Burchill? At this point, meaning that okay, he's a known former WWE name. Maybe he's reinvented himself over the years. I don't know. But it's not necessarily he's going to be whoever is giving guaranteed contracts now. So I don't know why they're doing so many of these deals on its face. So one begins to speculate, and I think there's a couple of things. One is that clearly they're scaling up their events to a certain degree, so they might want talent to be able to sort of disseminate to their different territories and endeavors. So that's one thing. The second is that maybe there's a media deal where they want to see more talent, that the talent's under contract, that they're not going to air one show and then there's no consistency between one taping and another because talent is floating out. I'm assuming that these deals are just speculating that these deals are sort of right of first refusal, kind of that you get the priority on the date. I guess is a better way to put it, sort of like the way maybe MLW deals are structured, or the way Evolve deals were, where you're committed, but and you can't sign somewhere else, but you're allowed to like work other places, because I can't imagine them giving most of the talent full-time work. So this I just came up with today. It was just coincidental. But it just made me think. So no smoke to this fire or anything like this. I'm just like an idea that I had. So John, did you know Dr. Phil has his own television network now?
On Roku, right?
Right. So Dr. Phil's Merit Street Media. So it's actually like once I got an ad for PBR on my Facebook, I was like, what is this? So then I went to look. Right. So there's the things on streaming apps, but it also is a diginet that covers 30 million homes. And they're also on cable systems. So as a diginet, they work with Trinity Broadcasting, I think the faith-based media company that's in most markets. And they're a digital sub-channel, through there. So it just made me think like, okay, a new station that just started in April. They're claiming over 65 million homes. So that I don't know if that would mean like if you have the Roku, like would you have to download the app to be counted among the home, or just people that have Roku like fall within that category? So sometimes the math is a little fuzzy, but like for me, like a faith-based network or faith-focused network that's conservative, that's airing PBR, like doesn't that feel like pro wrestling?
Yeah, for sure.
So like to have like Billy Corgan and the NWA, and I would expect like you probably wouldn't have to pay that much to get it. Like if there was a network that would be a good fit for them, like that would make sense. So just kind of on that. But just looking on 2300 Arena. So for the most part, there hasn't been a lot of movement on tickets. You could still get a fair amount in the second row. Any chance, Sean, they might entice you to go check it out?
Yeah, depending on what I'm doing that weekend, got to check with the wife. But I was actually thinking about it, believe it or not.
Yeah, the anniversary show can really be special. I know, what was it, 3 years ago now? The first time they were in St. Louis, it seemed like a cool experience. Then we
Yeah.
had heard of this PW insider, Mike Johnson, was reporting a few weeks ago that they were going to have a show in Queens. And I was like, I don't know. Like, and then maybe a second show in Queens. So they announced it. NWA is coming to town on September 27th for a very special show courtesy of CEP Pro Wrestling, who's a promoter out of Long Island. So once I saw it, it kind of made a little bit more sense. NWA on tour, they're just, sending some talent there. It's going to be at a Catholic academy. I'm not sure if that's elementary school or middle school, or if that even matters, but just to give it a little bit of context. So they're not booking an expensive venue in Queens, or even the venue that we'll talk about, MLWs or something like that. It's an indie show in a Catholic school in Queens with NWA branding and talent, and a local promoter on the ground that has a New York promoter's license from Long Island. So not too big of a risk. Like strategically, I don't know like where they're pointing, and like to sort of, if you're trying to grow, like spending time promoting this and building out the graphics and sending talent and coordinating from like a small crew, like I don't know, but why not? Like it's not going to hurt you. It's not too ambitious. Curious about it. Not curious enough to go out to Queens for it, but curious about it. And then, of course, EC3 has his promotion out of Cleveland, August 24th. And, looks like plenty of tickets still available there. 10 or more in the second or third row, still available at least. There's not a ticket map according to the ticket page.
What about WoW?
So Paramount Global Content Distribution is the arm of Paramount that distributes WoW Wrestling. To whatever degree, fairly successfully, right? Because it's not only been renewed once, it's been renewed twice, going into a third season. So, so Paramount Television Studios is shutting down, part of a bid by Paramount Global to cut $500 million from the company during a tough time for a traditional entertainment conglomerate. So, if Paramount is cutting out their studios, right? Like, what could be more iconic than Paramount Television Studios? Paramount Content Distribution, like, right, like, is anything safe? So that would be a shame if that's cut. I have no idea if it would be. It doesn't seem like there's a lot of resources or investment in that division in terms of basically inexpensive syndicated programming. So they need to keep doing something as a company. So I don't imagine them cutting it, but you can't assume that everything is safe there.
How about Championship Wrestling? What's the latest? What's going on with our buddy David Marquez?
Yeah, so speaking of syndication, and this is more like bootstrap syndication over a number of years, which is really impressive. So basically, after WoW, the most distributed syndicated pro wrestling programming is part of the United Wrestling Network, Championship Wrestling from Hollywood. It gets a little bit confusing with the different branding, but they had a press release. Gray Media clears United Wrestling Network programming on Ohio's New Rock Entertainment Sports Network and South Carolina's Palmetto Sports and Entertainment Networks. United Wrestling Network's Championship Wrestling, Memphis Wrestling, Derby City Wrestling, and Primetime Live continues its distribution relationship with Gray Media as we join programming on the aforementioned networks. Rock Entertainment will serve as the home so this is interesting. I mean, they can describe themselves however they want, but like, Rock Entertainment Sports is also the home of the American Hockey League's 2015-2016 champion Cleveland Monsters. Now, nothing wrong with showing AHL programming, but like, if they haven't won the championship in 8 years, you sort of have to let that go. NBA G League, Cleveland Charge, St. Edward's High School. So you can imagine what type of station this is. Sounds fun. Our fans are the lifeblood of Rock Entertainment. We are constantly looking for ways to evolve the opportunities our fans have to engage with all sports across the region. So basically, just to sum it up, some over-the-air sports-related networks are picking up the plethora of United Wrestling Network programming. Now, remember that Memphis Wrestling is pretty much its own thing, but they're affiliated, and it's sort of gravy for them, whereas the others are directly, from what I understand, under Dave Marquez producing those, while he also has the job with, of course, MLW and does all of his other things. I didn't cut the full press release, but I believe it said that their aim is to eventually get to 90% of the U.S. market in terms of syndication. I don't know how close they're pointed towards now, but they're pretty wide.
What about the greatest arena of all time, Walker Texas Ranger Arena? What's going on with that?
Yes, it is. For long-time listeners or even short-time listeners, it is one that I like to mention every week. So, new attendance record, 658 fans for the Summer of Champions X. So, not that we have to sleuth this like WrestleMania 3, but I couldn't find the tweet anymore, but I believe Booker T had wrote more than 700 fans. So, if there's a discrepancy of 50 fans or whatever, we can forgive that. But I just found that funny, but good to see that they keep growing. Seems like there's something going on there, some buzz.
What about GCW? Are these guys really stuck in Japan? What the hell's going on over there?
Yeah, it was funny. Right before we were about to record, I was like, let me just check, see if there's some other news so I don't miss it. And I have all the notes here for the LA show that they're doing August 17th, Saturday, August 17th. So as we're recording this, it's August 14th in the evening already. So assume it's August 15th. It is August 15th, right? Already in Japan. So there's a tsunami coming. So basically, they have 2 days to get out of Japan to get back to LA. And of course, LA is a lot closer to Japan than New York, but it's basically a full day of travel. So it'll be interesting to see what they'll do in one of their best venues, Ukrainian Culture Center in LA, No Signal in the Hills, if they can't get most of their talent out there. I'm sure they can, put something together. I don't know who was committed to what, but that'll be something interesting to see. Best of luck, Brett. I was thinking about DMing Brett and being like, hey, I know you're in the airport. Do you want to join us? But maybe I should do. I mean, hopefully there won't be a next time. But looking at LA, so looked like fourth and fifth row tickets as we're recording this were about to be sold out. I believe that they could add a few more rows, but looking strong. It's probably pointed towards another sellout. Salt Lake City is another story. I believe this is their second time there, maybe their third. Second row ringside, and the show is on Sunday. Has 10 or more tickets remaining in the second row. So obviously not that strong. The Homecoming in Atlantic City, fourth row has 10 or more tickets still remaining. And then the following day, the second row is almost sold out, but then the third row has 10 or more tickets remaining. And in Chicago, at the end of the month, you can look at their ticket page in Talia Hall. It's 6 or more tickets remaining in the second row and beyond. So, some softness for some of these shows outside of LA in wrapping up August, but I don't want to discredit their schlep to Japan. Obviously, with the tsunami coming, it's a lot, but in teaming up with DDT and standalone, and obviously first Korakuen Hall first, but then the other venue, which looked quite small, looked like sort of their typical US venue, but those all appeared sold out. So obviously it makes sense to them financially to go all the way out there. Also just announced, which was interesting, because we know that in November 2nd, they'd be in Hawaii. So I've been looking at the calendar sort of like, how are they going to get themselves there closer? Because just to go to Hawaii would be a lot, right? So on October 31st will be their debut in San Diego. So I don't know if they'll fill in the first or do something after the second. Probably not, as I'm trying to open up a calendar while we're talking just to see what days of the week those are. November 2nd is a Saturday. So you can do something on the 3rd. The 1st is a Friday, and the 31st, of course, is a Thursday. So you do have a little bit of flexibility for that. So we'll see how they fill in their schedule.
How about TNA Wrestling?
So TNA, looking at their end of August, double shot in Louisville in a modest setup. On the first night, in Emergence, they've moved most of the reserve seats. The second day, of course, which is always tougher for taping. There's from the second row and beyond, depending on where in this small venue, there's still tickets available. Also for both, there's still the balcony.
What about MLW? Seems like they've got some debuts coming.
Yes. So first, and this is always fun. I think one of the things, right, we're always talking about like what's MLW's like place in the pro wrestling market. Got to give them their flowers, or as Lex Luger once said, their allocades. They do a nice job of connecting family or legacy to the pro wrestling landscape. So Brock Anderson is teaming up with CW Anderson, and they'll be debuting in New York. No word yet if Arn is sort of like accompanying on these shows when he can, but it's just fun. I was was a pretty big CW Anderson fan, like in his ECW run. I always wished he got more of an opportunity. I don't want to body shame or anything like that. I mean, in Anderson, like, there's not an expectation of being like built like a bodybuilder, but it always seemed to me like at that time that he could have gotten, a little bit better shape. Maybe he would have had a more of an opportunity, but he carried the Anderson name well and still does. And good to see him mentoring a bit and helping Brock Anderson sort of get out there. In Queens, I think it'll be a sellout for Melrose Ballroom, which is a smaller venue. I see that in the ticket map, and I'm not sure if they do this usually. I hadn't noticed it before. There's like GA standing, which is sold in advance, and then there's like a small GA section that's sold the day of. But either way, I think it'll be a full venue.
What about OVW? How are they doing?
So their show that everyone was tweeting about or sharing on August 31st at the Appalachian Wireless Arena in Pikeville, Kentucky, has moved about 800, well, according to WrestleTix, exactly 823 tickets, 241 since the last update 7 days ago. So I think if they get over 1,000, I mean, for OVW, that would be really good. They have this big venue set up. They announced like a 10-person cage match. I was just noticing that right before the show. So I don't know if that'll be a further draw in itself, but just something to keep an eye on. But also more like institutionally, we talked about the need to refurbish Davis Arena, cool it down a bit, make it a more comfortable venue. So they're coming back on August 29th. That'll be interesting to see if like they can restart their streak. Of course, they had during Netflix when there was a lot of buzz, like a sellout streak again. So it would start with the first show. So let's see if there's interest there.
How about the CW? CW
So
Network.
sure. So of course, with tickets going on sale recently for WWE's NXT debut on the CW first in Chicago and the following week in St. Louis, it's interesting to see how the CW is doing. So during the quarter, we continued executing on our plans at the CW, reducing operating losses by $33 million year over year and $83 million year to date. Our organizational and programming changes are driving improved cash flows in the third consecutive quarter of ratings growth in primetime entertainment programming. So they're still losing money, apparently, but reducing how much money they lost. So I have confidence. I like Brad Schwartz, and I think they're pointing in the right direction with the CW.
What about YouTube and X? I feel like there's some big milestones that are happening and some big numbers that are being reached in the wrestling community.
So first, AEW had tweeted out, "Thank you, we reached 1 million followers." So it just made me think about like, how do I contextualize that number? 1 million sounds like a lot. So this is to provide context, not judgment. So WWE has over 14 million. TNA has 672,000. New Japan generally has just under 500,000, and their global English language has 215,000. AAA 270,000. CMLL a little under 200, and NWA a little bit over 100,000 followers. Now, when we look at YouTube subscriptions, WWE has 103 million. TNA has 4.98 million. So, like you mentioned, they're very close, well, relatively to 5 million milestone subs. AEW has come on. They're at 4.18 million. So, if somebody wants to look at some of those YouTube statistics websites and can look at how fast AEW is growing compared to TNA, you could run the numbers to see when they might catch up or speculate on that. I haven't done that yet. And Beyond Wrestling, which we don't talk about as much, they are holding strong at 3.55 million subscribers.
Speaking of AEW, what are they doing? What are they up to? It seems like maybe an Australian show is going on.
Yeah, so the sporting news was breaking that they're in deep talks with a number of venues in Australia. This is the part that I want to focus on because a lot of sites are covering the Australian news. Is that they're working with TEG, which, from what I gather, is one of the big, like, heavyweight live event promoters in the country. They worked with a division of WWE worked with the division of Sorry, let me start that over. WWE worked with a division of TEG when they've promoted shows in the past, in Australia and related uh, related countries, in that region, in that continent. So interesting to see. It also reminds me of like what's the place of AEW? Sometimes it could be like if you can't get WWE, and sometimes it's sort of like a tease to maybe draw WWE in.
Wow. I was thinking it was like a little bit of a work by AEW to try to get those three different places, basically bidding on where AEW should have this big show.
Yeah, I think that's like once you still have that open, I think that's something to it. I think they should move quickly because they have that Wembley Stadium show last year to rely upon, right? 80,000. But for those that are watching closely, if they're only quote unquote, right, going to draw 45 to 50,000 a year. The following year, it makes one question like, how hot is this brand and how can we draw? Australia always seems to do well for big time pro wrestling and even semi big time pro wrestling, right? Even going back in modern times, right, to when Nick McManus had promoted those like WWA shows, right? If it sort of felt like WCW, like, after it died. And WCW had toured there themselves. Obviously, WWE has done some mega shows, in the country too. So I think a first AEW show would do really well.
Andrew McManus, wasn't it? Wasn't it Andrew McManus from
Yes, thank
WWA?
you.
Yeah, yeah,
I knew I knew McManus, but
yeah.
who is Nick McManus? Apologies, Nick.
What is going on with BUSHIROAD, by the way? It's the financials adding up. What's up with Bushi?
Yeah, so for me, they put out a one-page summary of financial results on August 13th, and the numbers, like, just sort of like on its face, were kind of staggering. So first, down 5% net sales, down nearly 74% operating profit, down nearly 58% ordinary profit, down a little bit over 60% profit attributable to owner parent. So just made me think, like, what's going on with the parent company? We were getting some more color via Fight Opinion and others that sort of this was anticipated, that they didn't do well with their digital. There was a sense that New Japan doesn't make up, a big part of their overall business, but it is concerning to see the company struggling like this. Although their stock had been down recently, it seems like it's been recovering there. So I think it all has to sort out. But when you're looking at pro wrestling companies, especially when they're public, there's something to be learned by looking at the financials.
And finally, Louisville Gardens. What's the story on Louisville Gardens?
Yeah, I love to see like these old venues and like how they're surviving and like changing whatever. And what's now that I'm thinking about it, right? Like there's actually a story with every one of the four stops that USW, every one of the four regular towns that USWA would run, right? Like Memphis Mid South Coliseum is still there, sort of like as a husk. It's too expensive to make it ADA compliant, so there's always like ideas like to get it going, and like I don't know if it's died down, but there were like initiatives to like save the Coliseum and so on. Nashville Fairgrounds, we know it's still there, like in name. It was going to be Ric Flair's retirement venue till it was smartly moved, although I was skeptical at that time, but sort of like it's there in a sense. Evansville, right? That was the venue that GCW had even run. They were going to do um, sort of like close it for a while to do repairs. And here, Louisville, might have some life left in it too. So interesting thematically. So a local article. After years of limbo, plans to breathe new life to the historic Louisville Gardens in downtown are one step closer to being realized. Just don't expect shovels in the ground anytime soon. In 2022, Louisville Metro government signed a letter of intent with River City Entertainment to redevelop the arena at 6th and Muhammad Ali Boulevard. Both parties had 180 days to negotiate the terms of a development agreement after signing the letter of intent, but despite significant progress being made, that still hasn't happened. However, new documents signed reveal Metro government and RCEG agreed to amend the original letter of intent to extend the negotiation period through July to give RCEG more time to complete further investigation of the property. The $65 million Louisville Gardens redevelopment project includes plans for new stages for film, music, and digital production. The building's facade will also be restored back to the original design of the Louisville Armory. Plans also call for a building behind Louisville Gardens to be converted into an educational facility for local universities. RCG said it's still interested in the property and has started researching structural and construction costs of the project according to city documents. Through the building's previous uses, a 2016 environmental assessment found the Louisville Gardens needed remediation. A city official said that remediation process began in 2022 and concluded in March 2024. The historic building, which occupies an entire city block, first opened in 1905 as the Jefferson County Armory and Drill Hall. By 1923, public events took over the building, was transformed into an entertainment venue. A young Muhammad Ali fought there in the 50s. It was even home to Kentucky Colonials basketball team, Elvis Presley. Pro wrestling was also big at the Gardens, as we know. The venue had a thrilling history, but in the early 2000s, it all went quiet. According to Louisville Forward, the last concert at the Gardens was in 2006. It eventually shut its doors for good in 2008. Since then, it's sat vacant for decades and primarily used for city storage.
So the Louisville Gardens is still alive and kicking.
Still, it still has a chance, kick out it too. When you have like these large structures, like what do you do with it? And it's amazing these armories, right? Like even in my town, this section of the Bronx, not too far away, there's something called the Kingsbridge Armory, where they're like always trying to figure out like what to do with it. And like my mind immediately goes to like mid-sized venue. That's what we need. This place for pro wrestling.
All right. So let's wrap this bad boy up and hit the plugs. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at 2Man Power Trip. Lavie, what about you?
Yeah, follow me on X, Lavie Marg, LAVIE MARG. We are the official business podcast of PW Ponderings, who has recently come back with a number of articles and resources. So we look forward to sharing more about that in the future. The Creative Control Network distributes us. And check out the LinkedIn group, The Business of the Business.
All right. Thank you, Lavie. Thank you, everybody out there, for listening. See you right back here next week for a little business of the business. We'll see you next week.